Well, hello everyone. Very warm welcome to you all. My name's Susanna Warren and I'm the Director of Member Events at the Arts Club, the Members Club in London. I really hope you've been keeping safe and as well as can be over these difficult last few months. So it's fantastic that so many of you are joining us from all over the globe for the third of our hugely popular Giant Conversations with Space for Giants as we explore our relationship with the natural world. Today's webinar is titled What Drives the Demand for Wildlife in Key Markets? So we're going to learn more about the many factors driving the demand for illegal wildlife parks and the importance of preventing the poaching of vulnerable species in the wild. I'm so delighted, therefore, to be introducing CEO and founder of Space for Giants, Dr. Max Graham, and world expert Grace Ge Gabriel. Grace is the IFAW's Regional Director for Asia, and her mission to protect wildlife has been defined by many firsts, including China's first draft of an animal welfare law. Grace has been at the very forefront of global campaigns to protect and conserve critically endangered species worldwide. She's testified before the European Union Commission, before the United Kingdom Parliament Environmental Audit Committee. And Grace's work has focused particularly on Tibetan antelope, Asian tigers, Asiatic black bears, African elephants, and the remaining populations of Asian elephants. So Grace, we're so pleased that you're here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
If anyone has any questions over the course of the talk, do type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Dr. Max will then field as many of them as he can at the end. So sit back and enjoy, and I'll now pass you over to Dr. Max.
Thanks, Suze, and welcome everyone to our third webinar. We've obviously constructed this webinar around the challenge and the link between how we treat nature and the current COVID crisis, because there appears to be, according to overwhelming scientific opinion, a clear link. We've talked about the relationship between how we treat animals, particularly wild animals, and zoonotic diseases. We've talked about how you stop the supply in our last webinar, how you stop the supply of wildlife to key markets. And today, we're very fortunate to have Grace join us from International Fund for Animal Welfare, where she acts as the director for Asia, because Grace has been at the forefront of efforts to reduce demand for wildlife products. So this is a really important webinar. It's something that I think this particular topic is at the heart of what needs to be addressed if we're going to see any success in trying to prevent the next pandemic that might be caused from a zoonotic disease jumping from a wild animal. So Grace, it's great to have you here. I thought I'd start with, really to get your opinion of why it is that Asia appears to be the epicenter of demand for wildlife parks.
Asia region actually it's more than just epicenter of demand. It's a hotspot for illegal wildlife trade, from acting as source, transit, and consuming countries. There are many factors perhaps contribute to this fact. Weak laws, weak law enforcement, or lack of capacity in law enforcement, this is a region with a really large population, fast-growing economies. This is also a region with a lot of ancient culture and traditions, which contribute to, in thousands of years ago, people probably go to the wild and collect whatever they could find and use for food or for medicine. But what we really seeing today, the demand for wildlife species, particularly endangered species, is driven by an increase in wealth in the region. The increase in prosperity in the region create a large middle class, mostly in urban centers, who are coveting endangered species and wildlife in general to demonstrate wealth and define status.
That's really interesting. So I'd like to understand a bit more. I mean, I think because so many people outside of Asia don't understand this driver. So, I mean, you talk about it just being wealth, but obviously it's more than just wealth. It's these traditional uses. I mean, can you talk more specifically about these traditional uses of wildlife parts? For example, pangolins are cited as potentially being the intermediary host for COVID-19. What are pangolins used for, and why are they so popular?
Well, pangolin use, pangolin, number one, it has been recorded as an ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine. And in traditional Chinese medicine term is to eliminate stagnation within one's body. But there's also the new use of pangolin is really for pangolin meat is to demonstrate wealth and define status. Let me start from the traditional use to talk about traditional Chinese medicine. I think there is there is a misconception. People quite often equate traditional medicine with endangered species use. Traditional medicine is experience-based medical practice. 3,000 years ago, back then, a lot of people didn't have anything else, and they may use some things in the wild and to treat symptoms, and it worked. And so people start using it. And this, traditional, actually, I have a little bit of a story about myself. I owe my life to traditional Chinese medicine. When I was growing up in China, I had a high fever, and it wouldn't go down for days. And it was during the China's Cultural Revolution period, and all the hospitals were closed. I had, my parents were frantic, and they got a traditional Chinese medicine doctor who came and gave me a few sessions of acupuncture in my calves, and that brought the fever down. TCM is not just ingredients, not just prescribed medicine. It includes acupuncture, acupressure, exercises, massages, and a lot of the philosophy within traditional Chinese medicine is more to build up one's immunity rather than, to prevent disease rather than treat diseases when they happen. And also, in prescribing medicine, in the traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia, 97% of the ingredients comes from plants and minerals. You probably have heard of the malaria drug, especially with you living in Africa. The malaria drug came from a fever-reducing plant that was written up in the traditional Chinese medicine pharmacopoeia. And it's sweet wormwood. And this fever-reducing plant, the malaria drug artemisinin was extracted from this, and Chinese scientist Tu Youyou even won the Nobel Prize for finding that drug. And TCM has a lot of contributions it could make to modern science. And unfortunately, that 3%, there is a 3% that come from animal ingredients, and that it also includes livestock, not just wild animals. And that 3% is increasingly being promoted by those who want to promote the use of endangered species for commercial interest. And in fact, a Chinese medicine doctor once told me, historical use doesn't mean it's necessary today. It's very much replaceable, because when TCM doctors prescribe medicine, they base it upon a person's individual health condition and the availability of ingredients. So when China banned tiger bone and rhino horn from traditional Chinese medicine, researchers have found plant-based alternatives to that's recognized by TCM. And so that residual demand, if you will, for endangered species for medicinal use is really stimulated by the wildlife farming industry that want to continue to keep it. But then we have also a new use and new demand. The demand for you use pangolin meat used for people would host a dinner and have pangolin meat on the table to show, I've made it, I'm able to get something that's hard to get and rare. And this is the new demand that's driving the consumption of a lot of the endangered species that we fear are disappearing.
That's so interesting. So it's actually a combination of those who are either farming wildlife or driving illegal trade, combined with a desire to demonstrate status in society. That's a real issue here. How interesting. I think there's one thing that's really come out. I think many people before COVID-19 came about, they'd never heard several words. One of them was pangolin. One of them was furlough. And one term was wet markets. And there's been so much focus on these so-called wet markets being the possible source of COVID-19 and indeed potentially other deadly zoonotic diseases. Can you explain what a wet market is, and if indeed these should be a focus of efforts to combat the potential for new zoonotic diseases?
Indeed. Actually, the term wet market was a new term for a lot of Chinese. One of my staff, actually, she's vegetarian. When at one point in March, a lot of people in the West say, "Oh, did China reopen this wet market?" And she said, "Oh, what is wet market? Let me look up." And she said, "Oh, it's the market that I go to get fruits and vegetables." And I think we have to realize these so-called seafood market, wet market, is just like farmers market. Not all of them sell wild animals, and certainly not all of them sell live animals, livestock. Certainly not all of them sell wild animals. Let me go back a little bit to explain a little more about what happened, what Chinese scientists, experts had found at the Wuhan, Huanan seafood wholesale market. In December, Chinese scientists realized that some of the early COVID-19 patients had links with this market. So on December 31st, Chinese authorities in Wuhan closed this market. And on January 1st and January 12th, China CDC experts went to the market. Because it was closed, they could only collect environmental samples. And they collected 585 environmental samples, out of which 33 were positive. And 31 of the 33 positive samples came from one section of the market where wild animal trading concentrated. And this tells us that wild animal market is the real source of COVID-19. Because it explains a lot, because a variety, wild animal markets brings a variety of wild animals that in the wild, they may never see each other. They could from different regions, different continents, different countries, but at a wildlife market brings these different species into unnatural and close proximity with each other and with people. And it happens actually along the entire trade chain, from when you catch animals to when you transport them, when you warehousing them, and when you sell them at the market. Injury, disease, and the stress of captivities. Remember, these are wild animals. They're not used to being kept in close proximity, and also in small cages that's stacked on top of each other or next to each other, and with people. And that reduced the animal's immune system, making the viruses easier to jump from one species to another. And in this case, we don't know exactly where it happened or which animal it came from, but we know it happened somewhere in this process.
So that explains why there's been so much focus around wet markets. I know there have been some quite aggressive propaganda campaigns to the contrary, but that explains it, Grace. And it also, I suppose, underscores the importance of an intervention that really closes down demand for wildlife to prevent these sorts of conditions emerging that could lead to the creation or emergence of a new zoonotic disease. Grace, you've been involved, and I know very well because we've had previous conversations, you've been involved at leading campaigns to reduce demand in ivory, in wildlife, most particularly, and I think probably best known is your efforts around the ivory trade, but a lot of other animal trade. You've also been leading efforts to change behavior. Given where we are now, these sorts of campaigns are probably more important than ever before. And I'm curious to know, I'm sure everyone who's dialed in today to listen to you are very curious to know what's worked and why.
I think since you raised ivory campaign, and I think ivory campaign that we had in China is a perfect example to show how a campaign to reduce ivory trade succeeded. We need to understand the consumer is very, very important. I remember in 2007 when ivory trade, was legalized again in China, and we decided to understand what consumer know about elephants or ivory. And one result, which was even a surprise to me, was 70% of the Chinese didn't even know ivory comes from dead elephants. Because in Chinese, ivory is xiang ya, and xiang is elephant, ya is teeth. So people just naturally think elephant teeth fall off, and that's what they use, and elephants don't die. And so based on that, we developed a campaign to raise awareness. And the campaign is called Mom, I Have Teeth, is baby elephant dialogue with his mother, explaining very happy that he's got teeth. And then the mother is not happy because, and we tell people what happens to that. And that campaign, when we posted, when I took it to ad agency for testing, and I instantly find that, it resonated with the public. Ad agency, JC DeGaulle, the world's largest advertising agency, their China branch basically said, we will help you put this ad across the country. And instantly, when they put it on airport subways, and it went viral, and I even got a ivory carver wrote me. He didn't know that ivory comes from dead elephants, and he says, I have many other materials I could use. I don't have to use ivory. I have a young mother who when she saw the ivory, the Mom I Have Teeth ad, she was wearing an ivory bracelet. And it reminds her of her newborn son, and she said, she went on social media and telling people she's not going to consume ivory. And that campaign in 4 years reached 75% of urban China and reduced the group with the most propensity to purchase ivory from 54% to 26%. And so that campaign, we also realize when we talk about demand reduction, quite often we feel that if we just do some posters and raise awareness, it will reduce demand. It's not. The demand reduction cannot happen in a vacuum. We need policy support. We need stronger law enforcement that can create an enabling social environment that can further, stigmatize ivory consumption that will help reduce demand. So, our campaign further expanded, and when Chinese government banned the ivory trade in 2017, and that decision was supported by law enforcement because they felt banning ivory trade is shifting the burden of proof from law enforcers to criminals, and also, sends a very universal message to consumers. And we have seen the results. Since the 2017 ban, the enforcement and penalties for ivory traffickers or traders is going up, and ivory price and trade volume overall in China is coming down. And we have also got status from CITES to show that elephant poaching also was going in the same direction as the ivory trade ban. So in a nutshell, behavior change and reducing consumer demand, we have to think of it as it's a social change, social behavior change campaign, and not just awareness raising.
Yeah, that's important, and I think some of the statistics you just shared, I mean, they're really impressive. I mean, to be able to have that volume of people reduce their habits or behavior to no longer consume ivory is astounding. However, in a country that's so populous, I suppose you still have 25% of people out there who haven't been reached. That still is as a big risk. So it's that combination, as you say, of the government taking action. And I think that's a really poignant point because there's been so much, especially at the current time, there's been quite a lot of criticism directed at China around the issue of driving illegal wildlife trade. And there's been much less publicity about efforts by the Chinese government to combat this trade. Other than the ivory trade you just described, and I think I bear witness to the impact of that here in Kenya, where we've seen a massive reduction in the illegal killing of elephants, and that's occurred across the 9 countries that Space for Giants works in Africa. Are there other major wins that have been achieved by the Chinese government to demonstrate that actually they take this issue very seriously?
Yeah, in fact, after I'll just use after COVID-19 happened, when Chinese government realized the link between wildlife markets with COVID-19, they have taken at the end of January, 3 ministries overseeing markets, livestock and wildlife, banned the wildlife markets all over the country. And then at the end of February, China's top legislative body, National People's Congress Standing Committee, approved a decision to ban the hunting, transport, and trade of wild animals for food purposes. And this decision is indefinite until the country revises its wildlife protection law. And then in May, at the National People's Congress at its meeting, many proposals from legislators were urging government to cement that trade ban in the next revision of the wildlife protection law. And also they specifically would like the law to remove a loophole, which is wildlife farming for commercial trade of wild animals. Remove that loophole. And what we have also seen, law enforcers and judiciary officials were all welcoming that kind of action, because they have felt that legal loophole allowing farming of highly endangered species for commercial purposes is really giving these people, a minority group of people, to exploit wild animals with immunity. I just want to quote, it was very heartening for me to see a comment from a law enforcement officer to the media. And he said, he used snake farming to say, hunters used to catch only big snakes from the wild. The larger the snake, the higher the price. Now hunters catch juveniles and even entire nest of eggs to supply to snake farms, selling wild-caught snakes with a captive breeding label. Snake farming poses a detrimental impact on snake populations in the wild. So, these actions, government actions in China has really going forward. But I feel it's as you said, a lot of some Western leaders bring up conspiracy theories or racial xenophobic slurs to call the source of the pandemic, to pin it to a geographic location. All these had made this issue political. It was at a time when the world really, all the countries need to be united together to address a global health and economy crisis. Some people made it political, and that action backfired in China, and it created a lot of a resentment towards the West and stir up a nationalistic sentiment and anger towards the West. And that's really distracting the good progress that has already happened in China. So I'm glad you asked that question.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because if anything, this incident, this situation we find ourselves in, illustrates how connected we all are, and therefore how important it is to have some sort of unified action. I'm really curious to know about Chinese public sentiment to this issue. What was the original response of the public? If it's changed to being sort of anti-Western because of this negative propaganda that's being created, what was it initially when it became clear that the source of this pandemic was most probably a market in which wild animals were sold?
It was interesting. There was a post on social media at the end of January showing the wildlife trading section at this market. And there was one post in particular that was shocking. The post is really, it's an advertisement from a store that's called, let me see what it's called, Popular Farmed Wild Taste. Okay, it has species. It reads more like a zoo's exotic animal collection mixed with a butcher shop menu. It has live peacocks, porcupines, rats, foxes, crocodiles, wolf cubs, turtles, snakes, frogs, wild pigs, and meats, feet, blood, intestines, and other body parts from all of the above and more. Overall, over 100 items from 70 different species. And this post went viral on China's social media, and prompting a group of Chinese NGOs to do an online survey. In 22 days, that online survey captured over 100,000 responses, and out of which 96.5% of the people strongly support government to shut down wildlife markets. You know, that kind of response, and there was also another response from other NGOs that worked in Vietnam and Myanmar and Thailand, and that response, you know, globally, everybody just all of a sudden realized this is a big issue, and that response prompted a lot of the. In fact, also in March, a private sector in China, there's a company called Meituan, which is a food delivery app. It has 30 million users on a daily basis. And then, so they collaborated with us, with IFAW, we had a campaign, and just in a few days, that app removed 8,000 restaurants that sell wild taste from its platform. And then our campaign, over 17,000 other restaurants which don't sell wild animals signed the pledge not to sell wild animals. So it's just really overwhelmingly social support to address the true cause of the pandemic.
Well, that's fascinating, Grace, and very, very encouraging that the general public in China are so concerned about these wildlife markets. And I mean, that really brings us on to this whole question around what we might expect in the coming year, because especially from the government, you know, I think, as we just talked about, there's this real need now to have a global governmental response to this pandemic and the potential source of it. So, I mean, I think everyone's going to be looking very carefully at what China might do, what China's role might be in driving change, obviously not just in China, not just in Asia, but globally. to prevent the sorts of situations from occurring, which could lead to another pandemic. So, from your perspective, what do you think we might expect from the Chinese government to support such action in the coming year?
I think what's happening with not just government, in overall in society. I feel a lot of things that have already, happened, showing kind of a private sector want to stigmatize wildlife consumption, like the Meituan. But overall, I think what we can, expect is more, more companies joining the forces, more private sector joining the forces, stronger laws, and in fact, Chinese government have already, after in the process of revising the law, then they have already started compensation schemes for some of the farms that previously allowed to farm wild animal species for trade. And there have also, there have also been, an idea is to protect all animals, and then with a very narrow, small, white list of species that can be traded. That's because if we talk about pangolins, pangolins protected by CITES, it's also China recently uplisted pangolins into wildlife protection law on at the same protection level as giant panda, class 1. And China has also removed pangolin scale, raw pangolin scale from the official pharmacopoeia. And these are all good actions. But what about the species that don't fall into protection lists, like bats? It's suspected pangolin was suspected to be the intermediary host, but the bat, the virus initially could have come from bats, and bats are not protected anywhere by any sort of convention. So I feel that that's the direction that China probably is going towards. And these are really great actions. And from a global perspective, I feel that countries should really support it and echo that kind of responses to address the root of the pandemic.
Well, that's very encouraging, and yeah, I suppose the hope is that other countries will join forces and take a cue from China, and then China can hopefully guide the entire region, and other places, of course, where there are markets like this. It's encouraging. I suppose it's a final question for me, Grace, is, the organization I founded, Space for Giants, we've partnered with the Independent and London Evening Standard, ESI Media, as of 2 weeks ago, to support them with their campaign to end our behavior, human behavior that could potentially lead to the emergence of new disease, the way in which we treat nature that could result in the emergence of new diseases. What advice could you give us as a group to engage constructively with the Chinese public and government to achieve this collective goal? Because it's a little bit of a black box for us, and you've been on the ground for such a long time. How would you recommend that this campaign engages with the Chinese public and the government?
Yeah, I think in the conservation world, we already have a holistic approach, which is, stop poaching, stop trafficking, stop the demand. But viruses don't distinguish which trade is legal and which is illegal. Viruses also don't distinguish whether the trade is for food, for medicine, for fur, or for as exotic pets. That brings me, I feel that when we just need to broaden our holistic approach to, bring, this is health, our human health is inextricably linked with environment health and animal health, and echo the sentiments that's already coming out of China. And again, also, the campaign is from the kind of the other continents, not Asian continents. So we just need to really unite together to support that notion, that we really need to bring the health aspect into the work that we do into wildlife conservation. We have always, I think it is already happening with policymakers, with law enforcers. In the past, we have always just try to emphasize that from the species angle, they are disappearing. That's why we need to protect them. Now we have, it's unfortunate that we have to have such, human suffering around the world for us to come to a realization that wildlife trade really has much, much bigger implications than just species disappearance. So echo that sentiment, and that's positive, engaging China.
That's really, really helpful. And there's been this term that started to be shopped around, which I think is probably captures that, called One Health. Is that right?
Yes.
And, it seems to me that seems to be a really unique. It's a unique opportunity to really talk about that concept. Do you want to talk about One Health a little bit? Because perhaps that's exactly how we should be engaging in China, is around this terminology which captures both risk to public health, risk to nature, and risks to the entire planet, but especially wildlife species.
I have only recently come to try to learn more about One Health, but it has a more, I think WHO has a definition for it, which is to bring instead of doctors who look at human health, they work, they work this way. And then people who work on animal health work this way. And people who work on environmental health work this way. We're all working in our own silos. And so One Health is to break down those silos and bring the work and the scientists and people in all these fields together to address this issue. And it is a great term, and it in the conservation world, we really need that term too. I think in the past we have thought about, even at IFAW, we have thought about the implications from the consumption of wild animals. What if there are diseases? We did have one, SARS, in about 10 years ago. And after SARS, we were talking about that with some of the epidemiologists about this potential. But at the time, it just didn't didn't take hold. And a lot of people forgot about it, and we went back to the same way. And it's just COVID-19 really, I think the looking around is when it's ravaging the world. The economic impact of COVID-19, it's just no comparison to those minor, group of people who are using wild animals, and they are causing, how much do they contribute to a country's GDP versus the global economy? It's just no comparison.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Grace. Well, look, there's lots and lots of questions that have come in from our audience today. And I'll just start fielding some of those. This is quite an interesting one. It's from Chris Amos. He's very curious about the demography around behavioral change. So he's curious to know how many of the people, in terms of proportions, if you looked at those surveys, is it old people or young people who are supporting the closing down of the wildlife trade? How does it look in terms of demography?
If you are talking about the surveys that were conducted after COVID-19 started, they were done online, so it's probably skewed towards younger people, just given the nature of the way they were conducted.
So, but in general terms, and I know it's hard to do this, but say, for example, when you looked at the campaign with the illegal ivory trade, did you see a difference in response based on demography, on the age of the respondent?
Not well. Yes, but not that difference. But the economic status makes a difference. And also that's why I say the current consumers of a lot of the endangered species are middle upper class and living in urban centers. And so, in fact, this group has been our behavior change campaign, our target audience. It's that's the demography. If even including, pangolin meat consumption, I mentioned, including gifting of even tiger bone wine. Okay, tiger bone wine previously was considered to be, tiger bone was included in the TCM pharmacopoeia, and Chinese government banned it, but in recent years, what we saw is gifting of tiger bone wine or ivory or rhino horn carvings to business partners or to officials to court business and political favor. And we have also seen basically the consumption of endangered species have become a corruption currency. And that's why a couple years ago, I remember when China's president banned the consumption of shark fin soup from state banquet. And that has a very dramatic impact on the market, because I think it was like 80% drop in the next year, along with the consumption of a lot of luxury products. So
interesting. So there was actually a question around this from someone in our audience, which was, and you alluded to this earlier around this issue in terms of these farms have been closed down. So, for example, in the case of tigers, I think there's quite a lot of knowledge out there around tiger farms being in existence in China. So does that mean that those tiger farms are now closing down as well?
Well, unfortunately, the current trade ban is very much focused on the purpose for food. So tigers, not tigers and pangolins are not included in that yet, because that's why, this is something that still really, I hope that it's going to be addressed, because, as I said, viruses don't make a distinction what the purpose of this trade is. Having, tiger farms or rhino farms or pangolin farms makes just as much detrimental impact on those species as well as on human, a risk to human health.
So right now, I mean, despite the current situation, are those farms still in existence? Pangolin, rhino, and tiger?
There are pangolin farms. Although pangolins are, it's extremely difficult to breed in captivity. So it's not. I don't think any pangolin farm has live pangolins. But that's the point, quite often these farms are the laundering facilities for animals caught from the wild.
Interesting. So I suppose that remains an outstanding issue that we'd hope to see further action taken on in the coming months of 2020. There's another question here, which is, do you think the increase of Chinese activity in Africa, I mean, obviously China is the biggest source of capital to Africa now in terms of both credit and donor support. Do you think that is going to result in greater empathy for African wildlife that's threatened as a result of the demand from China? This greater interface?
I think with more, in fact, with more travel, when before COVID-19, more and more Chinese travelers go to Africa or seeing wildlife, it's helping them, have greater empathy for African wildlife as well. Yeah, it does.
So Chinese travel really to the continent, wildlife-based tourism in a way could be a great tool for education alongside television.
Yes.
So obviously there's been, quite a lot of good news, and I think it's probably a surprise to many people listening into this webinar, a lot of good news in relation to what's coming out of China in terms of action. Where do you see the critical remaining issues in terms of other countries, in terms of what else needs to be addressed to close this market down for wild animals that could lead to the emergence of deadly disease?
I think more countries need to. There are several steps I feel are important. On the policy side, more countries should look at their own wildlife markets. Wildlife markets in Asia is quite prevalent, not just China. And also another, the way we have urbanization has just pushed us closer to the, into nature. This is also something that needs to be addressed. And so from the to further, another key area that we also need to be concerned about people who are local communities who are living close to wild animals. And sometimes they are relying on wild, resources from the wild for subsistence. And that needs to be, it needs to actually protected and guided. And not, the trade bans I'm talking about is very much for commercial purposes, for people who are consuming it, for basically the demand driver is not survival or health, it's wealth and status. And that kind of demand definitely need to, that kind of trade need to be stopped. And countries need to, can help developing countries to, help with inoculate their agricultural practices, make it more sustainable and make it more compassionate, make it more healthy and make it more, robust so it will resist, potential zoonotic disease transmission.
I think that's a really useful point. I think it leads on to what we're planning as the next webinar, which is really about how do we address this issue of making live animals and natural habitat more valuable to local communities and to national governments, particularly in developing countries that hold those wild animals, so that there's less inclination to trade and consume wild animals, but more importantly, to destroy that habitat. So that was very timely. Grace, you've been absolutely fantastic. It's been really wonderful talking to you. Your insights have been illuminating, really encouraging as well. I think it gives us great hope. And I think we're looking forward to seeing action out of China. Hopefully, the forthcoming G20 summit, which I think is going to be the probably the soonest global summit that might actually be staged in person. We would hope to see countries holding hands with China on this issue, which is bipartisan, which is neutral, which is about the environment, which is about One Health, to see some action being taken in a unified way. And I think you've given us some really useful insights also for how we might structure our campaign. So thank you so much, Grace, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And looking forward to seeing you again at the next Giant Conversations. And I think that's good night from me, good night from Grace, and handing over to Susanna. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to echo Max's words and say a huge thank you to you, Grace. You speak so clearly, and I think I've answered a lot of questions that I'm sure will have been on many of our minds these last few months. And Max, you guide the conversation beautifully and asked such good questions. So thank you both. The Arts Club really is so proud to partner with Space for Giants, and it just never fails to amaze what brilliant wildlife conservation they do, how they mobilize governments, work to change legislation, engage key experts in the conservation space, how they educate and work with communities on the ground, and curate brilliant speakers for these events. So for those of you who missed the first two of our Giant Conversations that Max mentioned at the beginning, I highly recommend watching them back, and you can find the links of these in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Some of the speakers that Space for Giants have curated have included William Hague, Shamini Jayanathan, who's a criminal justice advisor to the Foreign Office and Commonwealth. We've had John Scanlon, who's chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, Max Gamera, director of Biodiversity and Ecosystems at the UN, and many more. So do check them out. And we've also included a link to sign up to the Space for Giants newsletters if you're not signed on already. So thank you for joining, everyone. Do stay tuned for the next Giant Conversations on the 16th of July, which will be announced soon. And I'll now leave you with a 2-minute video outlining some of the work that Space for Giants does. Goodbye, everyone.
This is the front line of the battle to protect elephants. Mobile units of rangers like this one in Laikipia patrol Africa's wildernesses daily in an attempt to stop poachers from killing elephants for their tusks. Since 2007, more than a third of African elephants have been lost, most of them from poaching. That's an average of one elephant every half hour, day in, day out, year after year.
There are so many challenges involved and risks from wildlife. We have had one of our team commanders who was shot on the thigh by some bad guys who were pursuing. So that is how dangerous it can be.
For Space for Giants, it's much more than just boots on the ground. It's making frontline protection smarter.
They cover several aspects. Other than just the physical, tactical skills, they are also, taught on some bits of intelligence gathering and how to work with communities to get information, to be our ear on the ground.
Through its projects in Kenya, Space for Giants has helped to drive a 94% reduction in poaching in 4 years. What's been underestimated and perhaps overlooked in the past is the importance of making the prosecution process watertight. Across Africa, Space for Giants is training investigators, prosecutors and magistrates so cases against poachers are as strong as they can be. Space for Giants' Faith Mena is currently monitoring more than 40 wildlife crime cases. Monitoring the trials helps to make sure they proceed smoothly.
Just like it matters with the rangers in the field protecting those animals, it also matters here because when it comes to court, we are able to reach not just the accused person, but members of the public. When that case results in a conviction, it sends the message out there: poaching does not pay.
The threat from poaching is still a very real one and must be eliminated if elephants are to have any chance of surviving. Hopefully, with improved anti-poaching patrols and stricter prosecutions, we can beat the poaching crisis. But if there isn't any elephant habitat left by then, all those efforts will have been in vain.